Before we go into the content itself, I thought it was just worth doing a bit of an introduction just to run through a little bit more background on today's presentation. Acutely aware this is a slightly unusual one and maybe content that you've not seen before, and I thought it was worth setting a little bit of scene before we go into the learning objectives on that. But first, just to sort of introduce ourselves. My name is John Netting. I'm one of the founders and COO of BareRock, who is a PI provider to financial advice firms. My background, however, is very much compliance and regulatory background. I've been a compliance director over 20 years, so I bring a couple of different facets to the topic today. And I'll just like to hand over to Julie so she can introduce herself as well.
Hi everybody. Yes, I am quite similar to John in that I'm in compliance as well, and have been for pretty much the same length of time, and if not a tiny bit longer. I can't even remember, it's so long ago now. So I have my own compliance consultancy, Chameleon Compliance, but I'm here today representing the culture space, which is a centre of excellence that I lead for senior managers under the SM&CR, and that links very, very nicely to the topic that we're going to be discussing today.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Yeah, so I mean, let's dive into that. What is the purpose of this? Why are we having this conversation? What is the why for this session? First thing is we want to sort of help people look at risk from a couple of perspectives. So we've obviously both got some compliance background, but we're also both looking at risk from an operational point of view, from a PI risk point of view, and bringing those different perspectives to the table we thought might be quite useful to help people, especially people holding a senior management function, understand the profile of risk and how they potentially might be missing some risks and where those blind spots could exist. Totally really important to acknowledge before we get any further that some firms are better than others at spotting risks. Every firm that I deal with, however, in some way, shape or form has probably got some kind of blind spot. You with large firms with teams of people working in risk departments through to small firms where it's owner managed business, those blind spots may be different. And we'll try and pull out some of those blind spots today. And not all of them you will recognise, but I suspect that most firms will recognise some of those blind spots within their own business. And it's really important that we understand that why, and the reason for the why. Why do we miss things? What is it about the psychology of us as individuals that causes us to miss risks or to not think of risks or recognise risks? Because only when you've got that base level of understanding can you start putting processes in place to ensure that you can mitigate those potential pitfalls and blind spots. So I'm just before we go into too much detail here, it's just worth signposting that risk isn't always bad. And you will need to take some risks in business. To grow a business inherently involves risk. So if you buy a client bank, that's a risk. If you buy an office for your company, or you rent a big office for your company so you can grow, if you bring on additional staff, all of these are risks. And let's accept that some risk in a business is both normal and in part, I suppose, to grow your business encouraged. But the important thing here is that you identify where those risks are, you look and analyze how those risks might impact you as a business, and then you can manage that risk, and you can make sure that it's an informed risk that is contained and managed to make it an acceptable risk. Going hell for leather into things is where risk becomes a dangerous bad thing. So let's finish off just with the learning objectives of today. It's quite a grand set of learning objectives, and we'll do our best to meet all of these. But the first thing is to help you understand why you might miss obvious risks. And as I say, we'll lean heavily on behavioural science there. I would just like at this point, really, really early on this presentation, to signpost that I've had an awful lot of help in the background from our in-house behavioural science expert, Babs, and Babs has helped me explain why the behaviour traits that I've recognised over the years are actually linked to psychology and behavioural science. I am not a behavioural scientist myself. I'm an enthusiastic amateur at best. And so please, if there is anybody who with a behavioural science background watching this presentation, I apologise now for butchering some of those content, some of the content as we go through. But objective one is to help you have that base level of knowledge that helps you understand. And then recognise how they might distort that risk perception, how that then flows through to the decisions you make, and how you can then apply techniques to help improve that risk identification and be more aware. And that in itself will lead to your having the ability to create some systems that counteract maybe some of those cognitive biases that come through in risk management as a result of psychology that we'll talk about. So quite a lot to get through. Before we go into the psychology and the behavioural science side of things, though, I'm going to hand over to Julie just to talk about the risk issues that she sees on a day-to-day basis. So over to you, Julie.
Thanks, John. Okay, so I work with firms across all sectors, all sizes and shapes, from high street banks to one solo firms, individual one-person firms, and there's a real pattern that I see when it comes to risk registers, business risk plans, whatever it is you want to call them, whatever tool or mechanism your firm uses to identify and manage risk. And one of the main things that's coherent across the whole of financial services is that quite often these risk frameworks that sit underneath those registers, etc., are just not user-friendly. Maybe somebody set up a very complex set of algorithms around your risk a number of years ago, and people have come into the business and just keep using them. There's never been any time when anybody in the business has stepped back and said, why are we doing it this way? What is it giving us? What do we need that might be better? What are we really looking to achieve here? And when it comes to actually utilizing your frameworks as a tool to manage the business better, they just don't work. And they're so complex, nobody can understand them quite often. So keeping it simple, I mean, the FCA likes to use very simple format of impact and probability. And, this is something that I advocate for, actually, because it means that everybody in the business can use it. The other thing that I often see is a really narrow focus on a specific area or areas of risk that are familiar to whoever's managing that part of the risk register or that part of the business. And it's because it's within their comfort zone. So, for example, if you're somebody who works in operations, you're going to be focusing on operational risk because it's what you know, it's what you experience every single day. If you are somebody more senior, maybe in an SMF role, for example, you might be focused on governance risk and oversight. If you're in the L&D team, you might be focused more on training and competence and that kind of thing. So think about where your blind spots might be and where those risks might sit within your business. Because what the regulator wants to see is that you are looking at, I think this is the next point on this slide, actually, John, is that it needs to span the whole business. So your business-wide risk is what the regulator is looking for. And business-wide doesn't just mean the parts of the business that are, if you're a larger firm, for example, just the parts of the business that operate within the regulatory scope. It could be other areas of the business as well. It could be your third parties. If you're a principal firm of a network, for example, that's going to include all of your ARs, or it could be suppliers or business partners. So you need to think about your business-wide risk to make sure that you are you're not missing anything. Because unless that's an exercise you do on a regular basis, and we could argue annually is regular, then you are never going to kind of question yourself. Firms don't typically take a step right back from business risk. They examine the risk register, and that's where their focus lies. And then the next point is that risk management, I sometimes see, isn't always focusing on everybody in the business. I'm a fan of enterprise risk management, which is you look at your macro risks first, and you imagine your business as a funnel. So your macro risks are your risks which might be largely uncontrollable. So economic downturn in the UK, COVID, something like that you can't.
Prime Minister's resigning.
Possibly, yes. Yeah, individually control as a business. But it could also, and then you use the funnel approach to kind of funnel down. So the fact you're a regulated business, or you might be a new business, then you move down that funnel to business function or business department, depending on the structure of your organization. And then you eventually come down to key person risk. Thinking about risk in that way and how to identify and manage risk means that you're not going to miss any areas of business. I can't tell you the number of times I've gone into firms and looked at the risk register, and there are whole categories of their business model that are just haven't even been identified as risks, because you're looking at labels, counterparty risk, regulatory risk, commercial risk. And sometimes that way things can get missed. So even if you are using that kind of model, using the risk labels within your risk register, your business risk plan, do every so often take that step back and undertake that risk funnel exercise. It will be really helpful for you to identify any areas. And then the last point here is that senior management engagement. Again, the other thing I was going to say about risk management, that it's often undertaken by people who are in risk or compliance or departments of that nature. But actually, each business area, if your firm is large enough, and that isn't always the case for a lot of firms, obviously, needs to manage their own risks. So they should ideally have their own risk register for their own business function, their own department. And the people involved doing the work day to day, go out and ask them what risks they're seeing. Because unless they are really giving their perspective, your risk register is not going to be true. And we quite often forget that they are at the coalface seeing what's going on day to day. And they will see risks that if you're in a senior management position, for example, you're just not going to see. You're not going to be able to identify. So the other reason it's good to include everybody in the business in risk identification, management, mitigation, etc., is that they will have more buy-in. If they're part of the process, then they will have more buy-in for highlighting issues that when things do go wrong. And then the last point here is about senior management engagement. And again, typically, senior managers are very busy. They've got a lot on their plates. But what it does mean is that quite often the risk committee or compliance or risk functions are kind of tasked with identifying risks. And the senior managers just receive the risk register, have a look at it, and go with whatever recommendations are made. And that's not really the right way of going about this. What the regulator, again, what they really want to see is real engagement. And I'm not saying that should take up 2 days of every week of every month of every year, but I am saying that there needs to be some kind of invested accountability for your particular business area as a senior manager. And don't forget that also includes what's going on around you, even if it's not within your own business function. Keep your eyes and ears open as to what's going on around you in other areas of the business, because it could mean that something that's going on in one of those other areas might have some quite significant impact on your business area at some point down the line. So those are just some of the key things that I typically notice on a very regular basis. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. And it mirrors, I have to be honest, Julie, what I find as well. So I think I'm going to just ask a quick question. Just bob into chat if you want your answer, but this is more to ask yourself the question. Do you feel that your firm is good at recognizing risks? Do you feel you've got it right? I still see firms who don't have a risk register, and I encourage firms to always have a risk register. And I appreciate that quite a lot. Compliance consultant may do an annual risk review for you, but that tends to be looking at regulatory risk rather than, as you said quite rightly before, so maybe incorporating in the wider macro risks, etc. So having a risk register but having a risk register that suits you is really important. All of those things now, and all of the points that have come through, and this is exactly why we did this, is to just signpost what they are first, because that now helps you understand why, when we start looking at some of the behavioural science elements, why those things happen. So we've sort of given you the answer first, and now we'll give you the working out. So let's start off with looking at the overall paradox of risk here, and that challenge of making sure that you're looking at things and you're understanding things. It's really important to say, yeah, we acknowledge financial professionals are incredibly qualified, and they are really well trained in what they do for clients, but quite often they're not naturally a business person. They've maybe not had business training. They've not had risk training. They've not had compliance training. So again, the fact that we don't necessarily recognise risks within financial services businesses isn't a criticism. It's human nature. It's natural, and I think this is why we thought it was useful to just pull out some of those elements. It's human nature to make quick decisions, and that will be the first bit of behavioural science we'll go to in a second. But those shortcuts, those quick decisions that are often made, that's the starting point, and or sort of the umbrella almost as to how you've got blind spots. Is those quick decisions, that quick risk recognition, rather than taking the pause. There's plenty of things that sit underneath, and we will touch on a good chunk of the main ones for that, as I said, quite quickly. But I think the important thing, firstly, is to just take that first step and look at the very high level. Why are things missed? Why do we make a quick decision on things? So the first thing to bring in is that there is two types of systems for thinking. Yeah, you've got system one and system two. So let's just look at what those two systems of thinking are. So your system one, nicknamed the Homer Simpson brain. So that's your quick, automatic. It's the things that are hardwired into your psyche from generations and generations of evolution, where you just quickly maybe make a risk decision based on fear or based on a preconceived starting point. That quick decision, that automatic decision. And it's important, by the way, because we couldn't use system two, that we'll just now look at very quickly, all the time. You need to be able to make quick decisions, and quite often that's essential. So it has its place, but quite often we don't engage our system two brain very quickly, which is the Spock brain, which is the more slow, effortful, methodical thinking. And we need to recognize, firstly, sometimes to stop ourselves using the Homer brain, take a pause, and start engaging our Spock brain. So,
John, can I just come in here for a second and mention something? I liken this to driving a car. So you're driving home every day from work. You sometimes will get home and don't even know how you've got there. And that's your system one brain doing the job in the background without you thinking. System two would be where you're doing a 3-point turn and you've got to think about what you're doing so you don't crash into somebody. But when we're in business, there's a huge amount of pressure that senior managers and other people in the business are under, and our brain, to save our brain the effort, we revert to the automatic thinking, which is where problems can start.
Exactly that. I'll give you another example. I love this example, and I'm not going to ask people for the answers in chat, but honestly answer it yourself. So let's say you buy a bat and ball and it costs £1.10. Okay, the bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? Now, if you let your system one brain answer that question, yeah, you may well have said it's 10p. Yeah, it's the difference between the 1 and the £1.10. Now, I'm not going to go through the maths, but if you slow yourself down and you go, hang on a minute, let's work that out mathematically, you'll get to the realization it's actually 5p. Yeah. So to make it £1 more, yeah, 5p for the ball. The ball is £1 less than the bat, so therefore the bat needs to be £1.5 so that it's £1 more. But your system one brain instantly goes to your Homer Simpson answer, knee-jerk, immediate answer is it's 10p, because it makes sense. And that's exactly what we need to stop ourselves doing when we're looking at risk. Let's stop that knee-jerk reaction, that driving home on our own. Yeah, and let's engage our spot brain when we're thinking about our business risks, so that we're just not going to that default immediate answer. And let's just look at we're going to look at 6 biases here that sit underneath that, and these are the things that can hide those risks. These are the things that often will trigger you to just engage your Homer Simpson brain rather than your spot brain. Let's have a look at, let me just caveat many more than this, but we'll drill into each of these 6 in a bit more detail, because these are the ones that I felt when I was going through this with Babs were the ones that fitted most neatly with my experiences and how people operate. So you've got optimism bias, you've got confirmation bias, you've got the availability heuristic, you've got present bias, you've got anchoring effect, and you've got loss aversion. Okay, so let's whiz through those one by one. Let's start off with optimism bias. Okay, so your optimism bias is that assumption that it won't happen to you. It's, I'm being overly optimistic. I recognize that there's this problem over here, but it's never happened to us before. It won't happen before. An example there would be, let's say you've been riding a bike since you were really little. You think the chances of having an accident are really small, so therefore you think I'll be fine without a helmet, because you're overly optimistic. Doesn't actually prevent the risk, does it? If you fall off and crack your skull open, that risk still exists. But because you're too optimistic about your own abilities, you discount the risk of the broken skull and therefore don't mitigate it. And that it won't happen to us. There is an awful lot, it won't happen to us. The regulator won't come and visit us. Let's be honest, we hear that a lot. Yeah. So having internally that overly optimistic position, overconfidence is a real danger point when you're thinking about your own risk. Confirmation bias is next. You can end up in an echo chamber, and this is a really dangerous thing. It's very easy to seek people out who share your view of the world, and you often work with people who share your view of the world. So you've got, as the graphic shows there, you've got a big population of evidence, and you've got your own beliefs, and the things you believe from that evidence are the bits that overlap. Okay, so if all you ever do is listen to people who share your beliefs and therefore only look at the risks that overlap with the reality, then you're going to be concentrating on a much smaller population of risk than the reality. Yeah, you're much more likely to seek out people who will confirm what you already believe. So be careful not to do that. Next one on the list, availability heuristic. Lovely term, I have to say. Yeah. So I'll give you a couple of examples here. So firstly, when asked if falling aeroplane parts or shark attacks are more likely to cause death in the United States, and I'll say the United States with a smile on my face, same country that had to put an instruction on cars with cruise control that it still needed somebody behind the wheel. But we'll move on swiftly. Yeah. So what's more likely to cause death? Falling aeroplane parts or shark attacks? Most people say shark attacks. Okay, because that is the thing that they recognize and see from the coast. In reality, they're more than 30 times more likely to die from being hit by a falling aeroplane part. That in itself is scary, by the way, but a scary statistic. But that's about this, looking at things that you see more vividly, or the risk you perceive more vividly. The graphics on there, by the way, are probably a closer example to for us in the UK. People are significantly more scared and see more risk about flying than driving a car. Going back to your point before, Julie, about going on autopilot and going home. Statistically, you are significantly more likely to have an accident in a car than an accident in an aeroplane. But everyone has a disproportionate concern and see more risk with flying an aeroplane. And again, it's that you need to think. So your risk awareness is more likely to trigger for things that have recently happened in your business, things where you perceive more risk. Yeah. Because maybe it's happened to you, or it's happened to you or it's happened to somebody you know. So you need to step out of that self-awareness and think about things that maybe aren't necessarily things that you would have thought of before. Next one is anchoring effect. It's very easy to anchor yourself to something that you perceive to be a problem. And the first piece of information that's given. So for example, oh, my apologies. Sorry, I'm on present bias. I see there you are. I'm not in present at all. I've moved on to the next one. So present bias. My apologies. This is short-term risks. Thinking about things that are a risk now, rather than things that might become a risk. Yeah, it's very easy to focus on what are the risks right now. Yeah. Rather than forward projecting and thinking bigger picture and thinking longer term. So it's human nature to run around firefighting the current risks rather than thinking about the long-term risks. My apologies. That significantly makes more sense than me talking about the anchoring effect on this slide. My apologies. Now we'll talk about the anchoring effect. Okay, so the anchoring effect, let me give you an example of this. So this is where, let's say you're selling your house, okay? You will have a value that you are anchored to of what you believe your house is worth. And by the way, people are much more likely to put a higher value on something that they own than something that they don't, naturally as well. But that anchoring to your current, what you believe your house is worth, will be very different, I suspect, than the person who's buying your house, who is going to be anchored to what they think it's worth based on maybe their market research. So maybe what it's sold for down the road. So where you've spent money and you've invested money on your house, you're gonna have all of that information, and that means you're anchored to a much higher value potentially than the person who's done a bit of online research, seen what similar houses have sold for. So you're anchored to whatever piece of information you've got in front of you. Yeah, and you run the danger of not looking at wider information. And in a risk debate, this is really dangerous, because if they've got somebody like me in the room who's really vocal and loud, my opinion might come out really quickly, and then everyone might be anchored to my opinion rather than getting the opinions of other people, where you maybe have a more open dialogue. Next and last is loss aversion. And this links to the previous one, but it's about your perception of value and how you feel about losses. And by the way, this works with clients as well. Really a useful concept to understand, full stop. And worth, rather than my quick version here, Google this one, and this one's a good one to have a concept of. But that loss aversion position, there is lots and lots of psychiatric theories and demonstrated case studies that show that people worry more about losses than gains. Okay, so if you've got £100 and you lose it, yeah, you're going to be disproportionately sad compared to how much you feel about earning and or winning £100. Yeah, and the loss of that 100 would feel much more significant than the gain of 100. So when things are growing in investment markets, linking this to the client because it's a useful way of looking at it, is small gains on a portfolio aren't felt with the same joy as, or as a proportionate amount of joy compared to the amount of pain that's felt by an equivalent drop in the market. Yeah, and that's why people get much more stressed about drops in the market rather than gains in the market. Okay, and that works in risk management too. Yeah, it could mean that you're much more likely to have an aversion to a risk that you perceive has a loss value attached to it than you would be to potentially doing something that would reduce that risk down. It sounds like it's a massive character assassination, this, and it's really not. Yeah, these are just human biases. We're hard coded with them. And going back to what we were talking about, the system 1 and system 2, these are the sort of things that your system 1 brain will trigger automatically because it's hard coded into your human nature and how your brains think. Everybody's brain thinks in those ways. So this isn't a criticism. It's just important that and this comes back to the why. It's a recognition why we need to think those through. Okay. So how do we think a little bit differently about this? Okay, let's start off with looking at optimism bias. And let's just think about how we could maybe mitigate optimism bias. By the way, I use the word mitigate there, and it's probably the wrong word. It's how can we take the fact that optimism bias is a real thing and factor it into how we think? How can we? You're not trying to actually remove it because it's a natural reaction, and sometimes they're useful. But this is how you can make sure that it's taken into account with how you think. So being aware that you have that optimism bias, when you're thinking of maybe making a business change and you're testing the risks about that, is scenario run it. Make yourself think, well, okay, what would happen if this failed? Yeah. What would be the worst possible outcome with that action that we're planning to do? And then work yourself back to try and work out how and why that might happen. So just challenge yourself. It's called doing a pre-mortem. Do that pre-mortem exercise to really think through business changes and try and work through and think to yourself, maybe look at what other firms have done and what's happened to other firms, and then just break down that false optimism. Next up, confirmation bias. How do we offset that confirmation bias? Ask other people. Yeah, don't just sit there with your own opinion. Yeah, deliberately seek contradictory views. Maybe have that devil's advocate, have the challenger role within the critical friend role in the room. Maybe pass the baton around a little bit and get different people to talk, in a safe environment, so that you're not just listening to that first loud person. Okay. Availability heuristic. Be really careful not to knee-jerk overreact to something that's just happened and giving that, and I think we're all guilty of this in financial services. So the regulator will bring out a paper and everybody then focuses on risk mitigation about what the regulator's worried about at the moment. We should be thinking about that, and I'm not diminishing that, but we shouldn't give a disproportionate amount of effort to that. We should think about all of our business risks. Yeah, and don't fall for only dealing with the current burning bridge. Okay. Let's look at present bias next. Okay, so we can talk about evaluating long-term and short-term risks. Yeah, so you could maybe, rather than just having a risk register with all risks on it, you could maybe have risks that could happen in the next year and risks that could happen in a longer time horizon. So you could maybe build yourself a time horizon in there, and that will force you to think about longer term risks as well as the short term risks. Yeah, and make sure that you don't just fix the symptoms. Look at the root cause. I think this is one of the other big problems with present bias is, this fun switch went wrong. All right, how do we fix that particular one? How do we make sure that that's solved, that's dealt with, rather than looking at the root cause and saying, well, could that happen again? How might it happen again? So go into root cause analysis, because that will help you think longer term than the short-term fix as well. Anchoring. This is a really dangerous one because you are likely to work with people that you have a similar mindset from, and quite often you might be people you've worked with for a very long time, and you really need to just make sure that other voices and other ideas within the business are listened to. So, I like the idea of maybe sending out a risk sheet before and asking everybody what they think their risks are, rather than doing it in a single meeting. Yeah, asking opinion of other people. Maybe getting junior people to speak first. Again, mitigating the loud person in the room. Yeah. Be alert to things that are numerical anchors that you're going to get fixed on. Yeah, maybe just ignore the maths, maybe ignore the business side of it, and think more conceptually rather than in monetary terms. And then finally, loss aversion. It says, there we go. Too many clicks. Make sure that you really think about things in advance. So if you've got, as we said before, an anchor to a loss position where you're thinking, well, this business loss, if we drop our turnover by this much, then it's disaster for everybody. You're going to have that loss, as we talked about before, is going to be felt more greatly than the growth. Yeah. So make sure you reframe the question and think about it in a way where you're not giving you're not forcing yourself down that disproportionate reaction and personal feeling. Yeah. So think about maybe the long-term costs of not acting rather than just the losses. Yeah. So really challenge yourself to think about things in a different way. This, by the way, and that one line there, if I'm really honest, is probably the key thing to all of this. Yeah. Is to just, once you're aware of these default behaviors and the reactions that we've just talked through, you can then start to recognize when it's happening. Yeah. And that's the power in understanding. Yeah. And that's the why for me with this, is make sure that you have enough awareness of these things to then spot them when they happen. And then you can start to build them into your processes, for example. So if we look at a typical 3 lines of defense, your first line, you've got your business operations, and that will help you with optimism bias and present bias. Yeah, because you can make sure that your first line of defense, is you're giving regular challenge from peers, you're making decisions there and then, you're looking at that particular area. You've then got your second line, that's your internal compliance and risk function. That helps you with the confirmation bias and the availability heuristic, because you've got independent people coming in, an independent challenge. So you're not insular in your own decision making. Yeah. Do scenario analysis, do risk assessment, team exercises, engaging other people, and that's where that second line of defense will start to become more powerful. And then, last but not least, have that third line, that audit line, and that gets rid of that anchoring, because that external voice, that external critical friend, isn't going to be anchored to your previous views, and those fresh perspectives are massively powerful. And that's why these 3 lines of defense are so critical and so important to come through. Okay. Giving you a lot of info there, so let's just sort of wrap this all up. Got a few minutes left. Let's have a look at what governance should look like from a senior management function perspective. How can the senior management set the tone? I think, Julie, you probably want to jump in on some of these, to be fair. Let's start off with what good looks like. You talked about accountability engagement, before.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about not leaving it up to somebody else to feed you with the answers. It's about questioning and challenging what's coming through your door on a set of MI, for example. It's not just at the point when the risk register's put in front of you in a meeting at some point. It's thinking and keeping your eyes and ears open.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the word challenge there, I think, is really important. And quite often, you find a structure where it's, as you mentioned before, the compliance director that maybe does all of this, yeah, and it needs to be engagement right the way up to the board, down to all the people on the front line, as it were, to make sure that you've not got that one person looking at things in their own way.
Yeah, and just to add to that, John, actually, something that's been a theme running right throughout this presentation has been the diversity of perspectives and diversity of views, which fits into that really nicely. It's not just about who else you're going to ask about risk in a different department. It is about those different levels, right down to the most junior person. But also, who do you bring in from the outside that is independent and gives you that third line quality? That could be a non-exec, it could be a compliance consultant, there could be a business advisor, there could be any number of external objective views. And if firms don't have those, that's a risk in itself, in my opinion. It's not a requirement to have a non-exec or an independent voice, but it's kind of, you need to ask yourselves why not. And sometimes that's because the board want to protect their own views, where we get the group think and all of those biases come jumping out.
And I think the reality is, if you're not careful and you've not got that independent voice, you will just all sit there agreeing with each other in that echo chamber that we talked about before.
Yeah, definitely.
And that links through to the next point now, embedding the risk culture, because it's everybody in the business needs to buy into the culture of recognizing risks. And I've seen some great examples with some firms of recent times where, the every member of staff in the business is encouraged to signpost a risk or an emerging problem, and come not just with the risk, I hasten to add, but also with suggestions as to how it could be mitigated. So really building an open culture of discussing those is critical, and without micromanaging, which I think is a real dangerous thing. It's very easy, and again, totally understand that when you've got a owner managed business, especially, that owner manager might be the only person that actually goes anywhere near that risk log. So really handing off some of that responsibility and giving the ability to more junior people to be involved in it, I think, is, without micromanaging them, is really important. Okay, so why do we struggle with people bringing risks? You've got to, under senior management, you've got a responsibility to take reasonable steps. Why does that go wrong? I think the first one is, and it sounds a little bit again like I'm criticizing, and I don't mean to. It's just, again, being the awareness of it, is make sure that you're humble with this. Make sure that you admit what you don't know. And as I alluded to before, don't encourage people to bring bad news early. So one of the things that we see happen, unfortunately, from a PI point of view, is that a mistake will be made on a fund switch or a trading error, and the member of staff maybe doesn't want to admit it. They get worried about it. They panic about it. They then try and fix it. And rather than having a culture where they feel that they can go, "Oh God, I'm so sorry, I've made this error." And I think we've got to have that cultural position where people aren't scared of admitting to mistakes.
I think it's important to also, John, sorry to interrupt there,
Oh, please do.
senior managers in particular talk to me about the fact that they feel they've got to do everything right. That's not what being a senior manager is about. You're going to make mistakes and you are human. But um, so do ask for others' opinions. That's expected. And if you're trying to manage everything on your own, that's a risk in itself. The rewarding people who bring you bad news badly, bring bad news early. I think we can come on to a point about this in a second, John, about psychological safety.
Exactly that. Yeah. Yeah. Next one, in fact. There you go.
Yeah.
But
I think it's important here, if it's okay with you, John.
yeah,
I talk a lot about this with firms and senior managers in particular. Um, it's okay saying, "Oh, come on, everybody, tell us what the issues are, tell us what the risks are. Our door is always open." But it's very rarely actually true. If you really want people to listen to you and believe you, you've got to give public examples of when other people have spoken up, which comes back to that reward point on earlier on, and also telling them once and in a Christmas newsletter isn't going to get you anywhere. You need to be going out actively, being with people and actively encouraging them and reminding them. If you don't do that, they're not going to come and speak to you. No matter what you want them to do, they won't believe it. So actually being out there amongst them and reminding everybody regularly is what you need to do.
exactly that. Exactly that. I mean, we just going back to the point we missed in between a little bit. I talked about it earlier, so I don't think won't do much on it. But it is really important that when you're making a business decision, do that pre-mortem. Think about what might go wrong with it. Yeah, think the negative point. Don't just think the positive point, and then just row back from that negative and think about what controls you could put in place to mitigate them. That's what risk awareness is all about. And it's often not happened. It's often, that people go, oh, I've got this business idea, I'm going to do this, and then when it goes wrong, there's that Spanish Inquisition internally as to why it went wrong. Well, it went wrong because it wasn't planned properly and that you didn't think through the risks earlier. So do that pre-mortem. And then last but not least, call out the things we've talked about. Yeah. When you're having a session in risk, talk about the fact that, hang on, I acknowledge that this might be optimism bias. Admit it when you're doing it by making it part of how you operate, how you think. Then you'll be able to mitigate that behavioral trait from causing an issue. Yeah. So the whole point of today was, don't try and eliminate them. Yeah. Try and build them into your process. Try and think about them as a positive, and then you can navigate around them is a bit overly dramatic, but you can make sure that they don't cause you a problem. Totally human. It's absolutely normal. Everybody has this. Everybody will have these pre-built system one biases. Yeah. Once we're aware of them, that's the trick to either acknowledging them, admitting them, or overcoming them. Okay. And yeah, as it says there, you think about that for your firm, which of those would really apply, and make sure that your processes, your risk processes, trigger that. We've overrun, so we've not really had time for any questions, but I'm quite happy to stay on another few minutes if anybody does want to ask any questions before we fire up and finish the session. Have I blown everybody's heads with lots and lots of strange information?
I think you've packed in quite a lot there, actually, John. I'm keeping my eye on the chat. It might be. Are you going to be sending the recording out of this, John, to participants?
Yeah, we can do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll have your contact details as well. And James is just saying, thanks both, got to go, but have a good afternoon. Thank you, James. That's a lovely comment. So you're going to be sending the recording out, and people
we'll do the recording or recording and/or slide deck, something. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll reach out to individuals as well and just give contact details, etc. But yeah, if anybody's got any questions on this, it was very much a whistle-stop tour. I appreciate, but yeah, feel free to ping me an email offline. No problem at all. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks, everybody. I think we'll end now, and hope you all have a good day.